slides there. Yeah, great. Okay, so I work on the Growing Up in Ireland study, and I'm just going to give you a very quick whistle-stop tour of some of the income differences that emerged in our special COVID-19 survey that was conducted in December of last year. And I'm presenting this on behalf of a kind of a wider research team at the Growing Up in Ireland ESRI that contributed to the study and the key findings on which this presentation is based. So if you're not familiar with Growing Up in Ireland, it's basically the national longitudinal study of children and youth in Ireland, and it has two cohorts that run in parallel. So both of them started in 2007, but they started at different ages. So our older cohort were aged 9 years in 2007, and our younger cohort were just babies in 2007. So the COVID survey in December was a kind of a special addition to the ongoing schedule of phases of interview with both cohorts. It was conducted in December 2020, just as sort of the second lockdown restrictions were starting to ease and people were anticipating a further easing over Christmas. So we approached both cohorts. In the older cohort, who will be generally illustrated in blue throughout this presentation, those former study children are now study young adults, and they were aged about 22. We had responses from over 2,200 of those. In our younger cohort, the study children were around 12 years old, and both they and their parent completed their own survey. So the surveys were designed to be short, just around 10 minutes, kind of completion time was what we were doing for, and for obvious reasons during the pandemic, they were all done online. We were focusing on a sort of core set of experiences and outcomes, just to kind of get that contemporary experience to fit into the overall trajectory of the two cohorts. And in general, when we were asking participants to contrast now with before lockdown, that was kind of December 2020 was the now, and before the first lockdown was sort of just before in March 2020. So these first results are mostly cross-sectional and descriptive, but future longitudinal analysis will be possible because we can link in with all the pre-pandemic waves of the two cohorts, and there are at least sort of 3 to 4 of previous waves for each cohort. So that's quite a good bank of information to be building on. And the idea is that the study will continue on its normal schedule, sort of post-pandemic. And we are actually in the field at the moment with the 13-year phase of the younger cohort. So that is ongoing at the moment. When I talk about income quintile in this presentation, I'm going to be contrasting like the highest and lowest income quintile group. So that's the top fifth and the bottom fifth in the income distribution. And that was income as measured in their interview, their last prior interview before the pandemic. So it's not their kind of income during the pandemic, which might have changed. This is their kind of pre-pandemic income. So there's been a lot going on over the last 18 months or so. So this is just a kind of a brief reminder of what the timeline was coming up to when we surveyed the participants. So in February of last year, we had the first case of COVID confirmed. Then in March, the middle of March, the schools closed. The end of March, we had effectively the first stay-at-home lockdown. By the summer in June, we saw a kind of considerable easing of restrictions, and there was an almost normal summer. And in September, then the primary and secondary schools reopened for in-person teaching, although most of the third level institutions were still on remote working, although there were some variations. But in general, the younger cohort were going back to school for in-person teaching, but those who were studying in the older cohort were doing it remotely. In October, the COVID situation had worsened and we were back into lockdowns in October. But by the time we did the surveys in December, the restrictions were starting to ease. So some shops had reopened and so forth, and we were expecting kind of a resumption of inter-county travel, etc., over the Christmas period. So that's where people were in the time that they were filling out the survey. So the older survey, that's the 22-year-old, that opened on the 11th of December, and it opened on the 4th of December for our younger cohort, that's the 12-year-olds, and they had up until Christmas to finish the survey. So that's where they were, that's what was happening at the time of the survey. So moving on then to some results. So in terms of the economic status, so both the parents of the 12-year-olds and the 22-year-olds themselves were asked how easy or difficult was it for them to make ends meet. So that was kind of range from great difficulty all the way to very easily. So these two pie charts, on the left in the yellow, we have the responses from the parents of 12-year-olds, and on the right there, the 22-year-olds in blue. So you can see, comparing the distribution of the two cohorts, they're actually kind of quite similar for both parents of 12-year-olds and the 22-year-olds. In the darkest segment there, about 11% of both cohorts said they had great difficulty or difficulty making ends meet. And that's what we kind of termed those who were kind of under financial strain, that great difficulty or difficulty making ends meet. If you go to the sort of the other end of the spectrum, then the light gray wedge in both pie charts, those are the group that were saying that they were making ends meet very easily or easily. And you can see that was just over a quarter of parents in 12-year-olds were in that kind of easy financial position, and just over a third of the 22-year-olds. So as you might expect, we can see, looking back at their pre-pandemic income quintile, we can see that there are considerable differences in the likelihood that people would say that they were now easily or very easily making ends meet during the pandemic phase. So again, 12-year-olds in yellow and the 22-year-olds in blue. The two high income quintile groups are on the left here. So you can see for both cohorts, around about half of those in the highest income quintile said they were making ends meet easily or very easily in December 2020 during the pandemic. But on the right, the two lowest income quintile groups, they were much less likely to describe themselves as being easily or very easily able to make ends meet, although it did seem to be more positive for the young adults, possibly because the young adults are probably maybe referring more to their own finances, whereas the parents of 12-year-olds were kind of talking about household situation. But it's interesting because it was the young adults that seemed to experience more disruption in their employment status. So this column is looking at the distribution of those young adults who said that they were employed either before or any time since the pandemic started. So about 3/4 of them had employment at some point. The very bottom in the grey, that's 14%. Those are the kind of 22-year-olds employees who said they had no change in their employment status. So they're very much in the minority. But what we focus on here is this darkest segment here, the 46% in dark blue. There are the 22-year-olds who said they either lost their job or were temporarily laid off as a result of the pandemic, or during the pandemic at least. And now they may have regained employment, so they're not necessarily still unemployed at the time of the survey, but that's quite considerable disruption to have experienced that loss of employment. 28% up on the top there, they had some other change to their employment, but a lot of that would be the switch to remote working. So if you kind of think about that 46% who lost their job or were temporarily laid off, and we compare them to the older adults who were the parents of the 12-year-olds in the other cohort. So parent one they're mostly the mothers, parent two is mostly the fathers. I suppose I'll just look at the mother situation. So 70% of the mothers of 12-year-olds were employed either before or since the pandemic. And actually for them, you can see in this top yellow segment, over half of them had another change to employment. But again, a lot of that was the change to remote working. And looking at that dark segment here again, so this darkest 22%, they're the ones who said they lost their job or were temporarily laid off, which is still obviously quite a sizable amount of people who are experiencing that disruption, even among the parents of the younger cohort, but it's less than half of the similar percentage in the blue column on the left here for 22-year-olds. So that kind of loss of employment, either temporary or more permanent, much more common for the young adults than the older adults of the 12-year-olds. Okay, so I'm going to switch now to have a quick look at the home learning resources and some income differences there. So again, 22-year-olds in blue, parents of 12-year-olds in yellow. The parents are talking about their children's experiences. So we asked both cohorts about things like having a quiet place to study, having a suitable computer or access to a suitable device for home learning, and an adequate internet connection for home learning. I won't go through all the details here, but in general, you can see the highest income quintiles are in the darker shades, dark blue and dark yellow, lowest income in the lighter shades. And pretty much for all categories, quiet place to study, suitable computer, adequate internet connection, the highest income families were more likely to say that they had, this was always true, that it was adequate for them compared to the lowest income families. Now, which isn't to say that all high income families had those resources available to them, and not all the lowest income families were missing those resources, but in terms of just a comparison, much more likely to have the access to those learning resources if you were in the highest income quintile pre-pandemic. Quick look at activities. So obviously with lockdowns and cancellation of activities and stay-at-home orders, like most people experience at least some disruption to the kind of their normal activities. So I'm just going to concentrate on changes for the 12-year-old children here. So this graph is just all about the 12-year-olds. This is the children's own report. The highest income quintile is in the darker shade again. And actually for terms of children reporting that they were disappointed to miss out on a family holiday here on the left, or disappointed to have missed out on a school club or trip, it was actually children in the highest income quintile were more likely to say that. But that might be due to their, I suppose, having maybe greater expectations of what was going to happen for them over the summer, as well as the kind of what actually happened. But for the other things, such as a reduction in organised cultural activities, participation in sports and exercise, or time outdoors, you can see here on the right-hand side of the graph that the lowest income quintile children, they were experienced more disruption to those kind of activities and time outdoors than the highest income quintile. But again, there was quite a lot of disruption to all children, as might be expected because of the universal nature of the lockdown orders and stuff. So it wasn't just low-income children, but certainly for those kind of cultural activities, sports and exercise, possibly because they would have been organised through schools rather than kind of having access to private facilities. Okay, so continuing the whistle-stop tour, I'm going to look at some differences by income in terms of information about COVID. So I'll start with what the children and the young adults said about what they kind of thought was the important sources of information about COVID. So starting with the general picture overall, so this isn't contrasting income just yet, this is just looking at the two different cohorts. So it's all 12-year-olds in yellow, all 22-year-olds in blue. So in terms of the people in their network, you can see here on the far left that the 12-year-old children were much more likely to say their parents were an important source of information about COVID than were the young adults. Children also kind of said school was more important compared to college or work for the 22-year-olds, but then friends were more important for the young adults than they were for the children. So that's the kind of people in the network. In terms of media, for both social media and watching or reading the news, the young adults in blue, they were more likely to kind of record those media sources as being important for information about COVID. Although I think it's quite interesting here, the two columns on the rightmost of the screen, that both the 12-year-olds and the 22-year-olds said watching or reading the news was an important source of information. So perhaps more children saying that the regular news was important than you might think. And there are some income differences here. So this is just comparing on those children and young adults who said watching or reading the news was important for their COVID information. The 12-year-olds in yellow, the 22-year-olds in blue again. And you can see that for the two highest income quintile groups here on the left, 67% of 12-year-olds and 86% of 22-year-olds in the highest income group said watching or reading the news was important. And this goes down to 54% and 77% respectively for two groups in the lowest income quintile. So still quite important for both, perhaps more of a gap comparing the two yellow columns, that's the highest and lowest income 12-year-olds in terms of what they thought the regular mainstream news was important, but still very high overall. So I think this is my last category. So this is living with vulnerable people. And by that vulnerable people, I mean, that's people who are vulnerable to severe COVID symptoms. And this is, again, just looking quickly at the income differences. So just if you look at the text on the right for a second, just the overall groups. So among 12-year-olds, 23% were living with somebody who was vulnerable to severe COVID. It was much higher for 22-year-olds, 39% said they were living with somebody who was vulnerable, potentially vulnerable to severe symptoms, perhaps reflecting to the older demographic, I suppose, of the 22-year-olds. everybody in their house probably being 10 years older than the cohort of 12-year-olds. And also a lot of the 22-year-olds, about 3/4 of them were living with their parents. So that might account for some of that kind of cohort difference. But we also see an income difference along with the cohort difference. So the two high income quintile groups on the left, 12-year-olds in yellow, 22-year-olds in blue. So if we compare the two yellow columns, that's 20% of high income 12-year-olds were living with somebody vulnerable to severe COVID. That jumps to 34% among 12-year-olds in the lowest income quintile. And for 22-year-olds, it's 36% in the highest income quintile, rising to 50% of low income 22-year-olds living with somebody vulnerable to severe COVID. So a quick wrap up then. So obviously the pandemic was primarily a public health emergency, but as Jim also mentioned, it was also a disruptor for other areas of life for families and children and young adults. So in terms of education, over half of 12-year-olds and 22-year-olds students reported at least some difficulties with the remote learning experience. In terms of general sort of health and exercise and healthy lifestyle, nearly 40% of both cohorts said they did less sports and exercise than they normally would. Although it is interesting that a substantial minority, I think around 20%, actually said they were doing more sports and exercise than usual during the sort of pandemic. And employment, as we saw, about almost half of 22-year-olds who were in some kind of employment experienced either a loss of a job or a temporary layoff. And 20% of the parents of 12-year-olds, they also experienced that level of disruption. So that kind of say, a lot of kind of that uncertainty in terms of income and things like that. I mean, there were obviously pandemic unemployment payments and stuff, but that's still, I suppose, a disruption to what probably would have been normal trajectories without the pandemic. And I suppose what we're seeing, because we're seeing that the groups who were in the lowest income quintile pre-pandemic, they were tended to be kind of have worse off where there were differences, and there weren't always differences by income, but where there were differences, it was the lower income groups pre-pandemic. They tend to be at greater risk, which suggests that those pandemic disruptions are probably going to compound that inequality rather than leveling them off. So I'll just finish then by acknowledging all the people who contributed to the survey. The survey was funded, as is the rest of the Growing Up in Ireland study, by the Irish government through the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. And the actual online survey itself was hosted for us kindly by the Central Statistics Office. And a wide number of colleagues in the ESRI and beyond contributed to the development of the COVID survey, in particular in a very short turnaround frame. And of course, we wouldn't have a survey at all if it wasn't for all the thousands of participants, children, parents and young adults who, in a very difficult time for them during the pandemic, took their time out to complete the survey for us, and as well as their ongoing participation. So thank you very much to all of those. And
thank you so much. Fascinating data and analysis. We have time for one question, so just jump in or raise your hand if you prefer to do it that way, but better just jump in.
Jim, did you have a question, or is that your saw a little hand go up? Or
can I ask a question, please?
Yes, please, Karen.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether there's any data that is looking at different family types, and I suppose I'm particularly thinking of people parenting on their own. I know there was other research done around one-parent families in COVID, and I'm just wondering if there's anything you can cross-reference with what you have here with the age of the children. Thanks.
I can't give you anything specific now, but I can tell you that the data that were collected as part of the COVID survey are just about to be archived. And so then it will be possible to look at the experience of different family types, because it will be linked into their what we know about them previously. We did collect some information about, I suppose, at the time of kind of what their basic family structure was, but so I suppose the short answer is it will be possible because the data will be archived later this month, although I don't have anything I can share with you at the moment because I'm kind of confined to what we already published as in the public domain for this presentation. But I'm sure we will be doing some more work on that in the near future. And I think, especially considering Jim's presentation and the input, I suppose, that from those diary entries from participants, particularly those people who were lone parents with looking after children without the support of this was a wider family network, that will be a particularly interesting and policy relevant avenue of research to pursue in this context, of course, yes.